Unis'tot'en Camp. My name is Toghestiy. It means man who sleeps beside the water. I'm from the Fireweed clan of the Unis'tot'en Nation. And I live behind a blockade. It's a blockade that's, like was mentioned earlier, it's 1,000 kilometers north of here. It's an hour south of the town of Houston on a logging road. And the blockade is set up to stop all these pipelines from attempting to do any work out on our territory. And it's been quite successful so far. Our history goes way back. Our history of resistance goes way back. You know, I was born and raised with my grandparents to spend a lot of time out on my people's territory, to walk our trails, to hear the stories of the way our people used to be. And it's kind of sad to kind of put it into that context, because, you know, why should we talk about how we used to be when we should be talking about how we are today? How our people are still proud, still free, and still capable of protecting ourselves, protecting our lands, protecting our children, and just going out and teaching our children to exist freely on our lands. My grandparents spent a lot of time teaching me a lot about the history of our peoples. And a lot of our history is based on resistance. You know, we were warriors. We still are warriors. You know, we have countless stories of other nations coming in to invade our territories and our people fighting them off. We have stories about our people going on war campaigns all over northern BC. We have stories of our people going in and wiping out villages of nations that insisted on breaking our laws and coming onto our lands and terrorizing our people. We have a long history of resistance, but it all stopped abruptly when the first traders first started coming in. They brought in disease blankets. That was the first act of terror on our people. Our people were terrorized. They're terrified of what was going on, of the unknown that was just thrown on them. You know, to put it into context, you know, imagine, you know, half of the first row here, you know, surviving a sudden disease epidemic that hit us here and lasted for 3 hours, and everybody just started spewing blood all over the place. And four survivors were sitting here going, shit, what just happened? You know, I know half of these people. You know, they're all just like me. What the hell just happened? You know, they'll be terrified. They'll be looking around wondering what it was that created that situation. That's what our people went through. That was one of the first acts of terror. The next act of terror, you know, the survivors that were still trying to make sense of what just happened to them and their families and their populations were forced onto Indian reservations. You know, the warriors that once protected our lands all died off. The great war campaigns became stories. The training stopped. The survivors were in survival mode, wondering what the hell to do. Meanwhile, you have these priests coming in saying, well, you guys can't do that anymore. You're going to have to come over here. And if you don't follow our religion, then you're going to go to hell. You're going to burn in hell. And he started sharing all these stories about this stuff, and it just terrified our people even more. You move on in history, you were stuck on reserves, you know, we can't travel around. My dad talked about, he remembered when he was a little boy back in, I think it was 1942 or 1941. He remembers an RCMP officer coming into the community of Morristown. And, you know, people following the RCMP officer, he was riding on a white horse. You know, he had his typical RCMP uniform on with the stupid hat, riding around, and he had a little booklet, and he would hand out permits to people to leave the reservation. People were following him, begging him for permits to leave the reservation. They wanted to go and get food on their lands. They wanted to go into the mountains to collect food. They wanted to go into the hillsides to collect berries. They wanted to go to their old hunting spots to collect animals so they can feed their children, because they were starving. Our people were starving. You don't believe me, go to the BC Archives branch and go and have a look at it in Victoria. Just look through anywhere in BC, look under any tribe, and kind of go through the old archival stuff. You're going to come across stories, letters that were written to the government by indigenous people all across North America that were asking the government to stop this process of genocide because their people were starving to death. You know, this sense of terror continued. The child apprehension phase, when our people were put into Indian residential schools. My grandmother, my late grandmother, Madeek and Sa'itne, she was a beautiful woman. I lived with her. I was really fortunate to live with her in her last days. But I remember coming home from work and she'd be sitting in the living or in the kitchen, looking out the window and crying. And I'd always ask her what was happening with her, and she would just sit there and cry, looking out the window and crying. She'd be howling when I'd get home. So I'd hold her and console her for a while until she calmed down and stopped crying. And I'd cook supper and, we'd try and enjoy the evening. And it's happened a lot. I never knew what was the reason for her sorrow. But I learned a few years later from one of my great aunts. She was married to my grandmother's brother. And she told me that when my grandmother's brother went to Indian residential school, he went with 3 of his sisters and 1 of his brothers. And he was there for the entire duration of that time. And he saw what had happened to other children there. He saw what had happened to 3 of his sisters and 1 of his brothers. They just quit coming home. There was no explanation of what happened to them. There was no description to the family about, your children aren't here because of this. There was nothing like that. There was just, they didn't make it home, and, the family just sat there puzzled, wondering what was happening. Can you imagine if any of you have children? If your kids went to school and they didn't come back and the school didn't explain why, but the school knew why. Another form of terror was imposed on our people. Our children were coming back terrorized of the state. Those children are still alive today. Many of those children are still alive. Many of those children make up our population of elders today. And they're still terrified of the state. That's what we have to overcome in our community. That's what we have to overcome as Unis'tot'en people in our communities. We have elders that are terrified of what we're doing to go out and defend our lands, to occupy our lands again. They look at us and go, "Don't do that. No." And they nudge us on the side and, "You're going to get in trouble. You're going to get in trouble. They're going to hate us for it. Don't do that." And they would just be so terrified. The police are going to come and get us. They're going to put us in jail. This is words coming from our elders, our leaders. And it was deliberate. The state deliberately imposes terror on our people so that we don't stand up for ourselves. Unfortunately for them, there's a new generation of Unis'tot'en, of indigenous people all over the world that are beginning to stand up and speak for ourselves, to stand for ourselves, to say, hold on, this continuous act of terror is bullshit and it's going to stop. And it's stopping here. And that's what we're doing. We're having to face some of our own people and standing up and defending our lands. And it's difficult because you have to face these same people who know what this idea of terror is. They know what the cops can do. They've heard about it through their grandparents, their parents, their uncles, their aunts and stuff. They've seen what the state can do. My grandfather was thrown in jail for holding a feast out in public. He went to a prison for a while and he came out and he just went right back to what he was doing. He started another feast and he held it out in the open and he challenged the government. The cops didn't find out about it. He finished his feast. He took care of his business. It was his responsibility. I was really lucky. I got raised by him and my grandmother. They weren't afraid of things. My grandmother used to tell me when I was growing up and they'd bring me around a territory, she'd say, "Okay, now you're going to enter into one of your territories. When you grow up, you have to look after this place. There's orange bags hanging in those trees over there. That's because the white man came in and they sprayed these things all over the trees so they can kill all these other brush and stuff underneath. What they don't know is they're killing all the animals, so we can't hunt, we can't trap, we can't do anything anywhere near this area. I'll show you where we can start doing that again." So we'd have to go down the road a long ways away from this place where they were spraying pesticides and herbicides. And she said, okay, I think it's safe around here. You can start setting your traps again. When you grow up, you have to stop them from doing that on your territory. And that was something that kind of stuck in my brain when I was a little kid. You know, listening to my grandmother tell me those stories in the back, giving me those very strong directions. Because she didn't ever tell us, or tell me, that those territories used to belong to us. She didn't ever tell me that those territories used to belong to us and now it's belonged by the state and they're regulating everything. So if you can go through their process, maybe you can submit an application and, you know, do an appeal process and blah, blah, blah. She didn't ever say anything like that. When you grow up, you look after your territory. Those are her words. And I followed those words. I had to. It was my responsibility. She passed away. I made a promise I was going to do that, and I'm still doing that today. The Unis'tot'en set up a blockade. The Unis'tot'en set up a blockade a few years ago. The Laksamasu, my clan, stood up with them and said, we're going to join you guys on this. We have a territory that's neighboring the Unis'tot'en territory. And we want to make sure that that territory is protected. It's one of the places where that big war party, the one I told you guys about that, went to the coast and wiped out a village. And our war party passed through that territory. It's sacred to our people. We have stories, we have campsites that describe how people got names along that war path. And they're within my clan's territory. The Unis'tot'en made a stand and said, we can't take this anymore. You know, the treaty process is distracting us from our business. It's there to distract us from looking after our territories. And it was. You know, we won the biggest court case of the land, the Supreme Court of Canada court case called Delgamuukw versus the Queen in 1997. The government and corporations were supposed to consult with us in a meaningful way. And that has never ever happened. Their form of consultation today is to send a letter into our people to say you have 30 days to answer this. If you have any specific claims on this specific site along the specific corridor or within a specific polygon, you can express your claims to that specific site. And that's their form of consultation. It's not meaningful. Our people decided to take a stand and say, no, we have to go and look after our territories ourselves. So in this process of doing this, we have to go and create allies. We have to build allyship. Because we know the government of Canada, you know, is on a witch hunt for any Aboriginal person out there. Any Aboriginal person who's willing to take a stand for their own lands. So, you know, we went to the States a few times to talk with a lot of our neighbors down south about our struggle and their struggle and look at the parallels. But on our trip down there and back again, we got harassed at the border. You know, 7 hours we had to sit there. You know, they kept us sitting there in the brown person line. We just sat there for 7 hours waiting. And all these white people were running by using the bathroom. And if we needed to go to the bathroom, we'd have to stand there and they'd search us. We had to lift up our pant leg, lift up our shirts, and they'd do that with us. And then they would say, okay, you can go in there. And they'd buzz open the door. But if a white person came in and they were like, oh, I need to go to the bathroom. I'm like, oh, yeah, we're right over there. Click, open it up and let them in and out the door and they're gone. But all of us brown people were still sitting there a whole freaking day. One guy was sitting there longer than us. But they took our truck, took it into a closed garage in the back, and ransacked it. They took apart panels. We had the back full of food that we bought at some organic shops down in the States. We could bring it back to camp, food and supplies. They tore through it all, ruined about half of our stuff, made a huge mess of it, and then laughed openly when they gave the truck keys back to us. You know, that form of harassment, you know, continues to today. Just a few weeks ago, you know, we had a bombing at our camp, at our blockade. You know, I think they were expecting us to be terrified. We weren't. We just were very methodical in our approach in dealing with it. We had to walk through the darkness and find out who the perpetrators were. If they're still out there, we were going to find them. You know, this sense of terror has stopped with my generation. We're not afraid of, you know, bullshit tactics like that. We'll face these guys off anywhere they are, especially in our own backyard. we walked into the darkness and we were yelling out. I was yelling out, as loud as I can because I didn't know if there were still people there. Hope you wrote your fucking will, because you're going to get it. And I was yelling it loud. So if there was people out there, they were gonna take off. We had a burn-in of a bridge in the territory as well, shortly after that. We don't know who's doing it. Our community is, they're struggling. A lot of them don't want pipelines. They're adamantly saying we have to stop these pipelines. But what's the government doing? They come in and they decide to pull all these funds away from our communities to make us even suffer even more. We're losing these funds from the government because we're stewards of the crown. We're living on reservations that we shouldn't be living on in the first place. The resources that sustained us in the past are being stolen from under us. And they want to keep it that way. They want to make it worse for us. They want to make themselves richer in that process. And we're not going to let them do that. Anybody who comes into the territory now, they have to go through an FPIC protocol, Free Part Informed Consent Protocol. And this is long before the UN ever adopted it. This is something that existed amongst our people. If anybody came into our territory, they had to pass a series of questions. One of the most important questions that we ask is, how will your actions benefit the owners of these territories? And people have to answer those questions honestly. The cops tried coming in. They had a special investigations unit that came in to try and cross into our territory. And we said, if you're going to come and attempt to cross into our territory, you have to go through this protocol process. So we started to ask them questions, and they were both standing there. There was two of them in a car. One had a camera, and two of them were standing up by the bridge. And we started asking them these questions, and they looked at each other laughing, and like, oh, this is like a border crossing. And we're like, well, it is a border crossing. And they didn't want to answer those questions. So we said, well, if you're not going to answer these questions, you're not going to entertain these questions, then you're not going to be allowed in. You can just turn around and go back. And they didn't know what to do. They just kind of stood there for a while. They're like, okay. And they just turned around and got in their SUV and, blacked out windows and everything. Weird. They got in their SUV and drove off. Conservation officers coming in, hands in their pistols, like trying to act like they're John Wayne, saying, oh, I'm here to protect the environment. And they're like, no, it's already been done. We're doing a better job than you guys ever did. And that's what we're doing there. This is our traditional territories. It's unceded, it's occupied, and we went back out to our lands where our ancestors were waiting for us. They've been waiting for our people to leave those reservations, to come back onto our lands and occupy our lands the way we were supposed to. And that same sentiment goes out to other people who struggle with the same issues around the world. Our Palestinian sisters and brothers out there who are struggling with the same issues with imperialism, with global imperialism, multinational companies interfering with government bodies to create terrorist lists. We stand in solidarity with everybody. Our Mi'kmaq friends. Our friends, Wolverine, he's a good friend of mine from Gustafson Lake. I visit him every chance I get when I head out to chase. And he gifted us with a whole bunch of stuff from his garden the last time. Every time I see him, he's like, did it start? Did it start? Do I have to go? And I'm like, no, not yet. But yeah, if you guys can kind of keep in mind, there's Indigenous people here who are struggling. There's a whole history of terror that we've experienced. There's a lot of Indigenous people who are still experiencing that terror, don't know how to deal with it. They're like sitting there going, damn it, I want to stand up, but this is going to happen to me. My children, what do I do? I'm going to end up in jail, and I'll end up in the welfare, in the ministry's care. These threats are there. These threats and the real results of those threats are terrorizing our people today. The terrorists are out there, and we need to defeat them as grassroots people. And we're not going to do it by ourselves. We need people like you and all of your friends to come and join us. Now,